Hi, everybody. Hope you're all doing well and hanging in there as we go into our third and final week of this online version of our course. I hope things start to get a little bit easier for all of you, at least once the academic pressures are over, which will be soon, I hope. And please don't hesitate to get in touch with me if there's anything I can do, or just keep me posted. So this is my last recorded lecture, and you can listen to it when you'd like. As last week, I'm going to be following up at 1 o'clock today with an open session in Blackboard. So you can come drop in whenever you want to discuss this, and also holding office hours Friday morning as usual. So, and if you need a one-to-one meeting, just email me. So so this has ended up being our last class, and we're ending up on a rather different note than on different circumstances, but also a different place than we have been planning to end up had this virus not completely interrupted everything. But it's not a bad place to be ending, actually. I wouldn't have chosen to end here, but it's not a bad place to be ending, because it does give you more to think about. To pause right here, I've been stressing a lot of late how often Hegel ends up on a cliffhanger. He ends his episodes just with a situation from which you can't really begin to imagine how the spirit is going to extricate itself, and yet sometimes it does. I'm sorry, my phone is sorry, just 1 second. Okay. And yet somehow it does. And this is a massive. This is the section that we're looking at today. Absolute freedom and terror is the ultimate cliffhanger, and this is where I'm going to leave you as we wind up the course. This section, Absolute Freedom and Terror, which is one of the most gripping sections, I think, in the phenomenology, winds up the main strand of the historical, philosophical, political arc that began with the start of chapter 6, Ethical Life. As we've been watching, through all these turmoil and all these convolutions, we've been watching spirit attempt to articulate a coherent, a tenable, a livable theory and practice as it searches for, again and again, failing, trying again, failing better, trying again, to articulate a political, institutional form of living that will do justice to Hegel's ever so enigmatic formula regarding the I that is we and the we that is I. That was kind of dangled before us in paragraph 177 on a day that now seems like an eternity ago. Anyway, as you know, that political experiment had begun with Hegel's version of the ancient Greek polis, and it ends now where we are with the French Revolutionary Terror. This is, of course, not the end of Spirit's experiment generally. We still have 200 pages to go, but it is the end of the political experiment. So after the episode of the terror, there will be no more attempts to solve the problem of spirit, just to figure out what the I that is we and the we that is I in explicitly political, social, or institutional forms. I mean, the experiment will take a very different course after this point. So there's something special about this episode. First of all, when Hegel lights down on the French Revolution, which he really, and what interests him in the revolution is the revolutionary terror, which was one particularly bloody phase of the revolution, which captured his imagination. First, that this event is that he's looking at is unfolding more or less simultaneously as the phenomenology is being written. So there's a real-time quality to Hegel's philosophical exegesis. This is not ancient history. It's not. It's not something that has been highly processed by anyone before. It's history as it unfolds in the more or less present tense. Hegel's been following the French Revolution avidly from a little distance, being next door in Germany. He's been reading the newspapers. He, as a student, he was just in love with the French Revolution. He supposedly danced around the freedom tree with his schoolmates, and he's has a somewhat different reaction to it now, um, but his relationship to it takes it absolutely seriously as a vital stage in the development of political consciousness. So nowhere does he dismiss it or really denigrate it, or disavow it as an accident or something that could or should have been avoided. He embraces it fully, as a historical truth and as a historical necessity, and something from which alone real freedom can emerge. So Napoleon's, as I mentioned before, Napoleon's troops are literally at the door as Hegel, not as Hegel's writing this chapter, but as Hegel, is writing the preface to the Phenomenology, is getting ready to send off the package to his publishers, and the troops invade, and this is the birth of the Phenomenology. So it's kind of the presentness of it is really gripping, and this is partly what makes his language and his images and the tone of it so gripping. Um, it's not over. This is happening in real time, and who knows how it will end? Hegel doesn't know how it will end. Napoleon has just entered, but we just don't know. He doesn't know. We know in hindsight, but he doesn't know in 1806 what is going to happen to world history at all. Um, so so that's my first point. This is real time events becoming philosophy, turning into philosophy before your eyes. My second point is it's the last, as I said, the last political experiment. Now Hegel presents it, this is true, as a spectacularly failed experiment, but it's a necessary failure. It's a dialectical failure from which he is confident, from which freedom in its most universal form will emerge. There will be no, however, politically speaking, spirit seems to have come to a kind of dead end. There will be no successor to the French Revolutionary Terror. There'll be not even a hint of what kind of social formation might be in the works or might be plausible at this point. The phenomenology itself is not over, but it will cease to become, from this point on, it will cease to be expressed as a social or political philosophy. So we're left with this very unsatisfied sense that the question of political life is really quite unresolved. We don't actually have a political shape for spirit, even though spirit continues to cast around for a couple hundred pages for some way to express itself. So this is a cliffhanger of a really major sort. After this, spirit just kind of has to leap away. It has to leap away from politics to another zone altogether. Hegel in paragraph 595 speaks of another land. Spirit migrates from the sphere of politics to the sphere of philosophical speculation, moral philosophy, religion, art, and so on. But this also involves a kind of geographical migration, as spirit is literally being relocated to another country, which happens to be Germany, Hegel's country, where Hegel himself is processing all these political events and transforming them into some kind of philosophical reality. So spirit will migrate after this until it gets finally to this thing or this place called absolute knowing at the end, about which, since we're obviously not going to be able to get there this year, all I can say is sorry. Blame COVID-19 for that. But you would have been disappointed had we actually managed to get there, because absolute knowing turns out to be, if you do get there, will turn out to be a resounding anticlimax. Still, I would have loved to talk to you about just why it had to be so anticlimactic, and why this anticlimax is so compelling and gives us so much food for thought. But we'd have to postpone that for another day. So we've been following the trajectory, the developing circuitry between the individual and the universal, from the supposed harmony between the individual and his or her social context, in the ethical life, through the dissonances of self-alienated culture, where the tension between individual and universal, between the I and the we, is sharply registered, through the various efforts and failures to overcome this discordance, the failure of absolute monarchy, the shattering of language into witty, disruptive garble, the attempt by Enlightenment to penetrate everything different, everything outside it, to assault and infect everything in its path, culminating, and this is where we are right now, the transition we're about to go through right now, culminating in the attitude of utility, which is really the hyperbolic expression of the attitude, this stance of enlightenment, where the whole world is not only reduced to human reason, but is reduced to something that I can make use of. Everything becomes fungible or exchangeable, insofar as everything exists for me, for my purposes. Because everything exists for me, everything's the same. It's just material for my own use. So it's, in this sense, its value is mine. It's what I make of it. So there's a strange confirmation of universality here, because everything is interchangeable, everything is universally mine. And this is the trajectory that culminates, as Hegel, thinks it through in this situation of terror. You go from using the world, using up the world, to needing to eliminate it. The world becomes the place on which my freedom is exercised, and the full exercise of my freedom is ultimately expressed as a destructive exercise, because my freedom can countenance it can stand to be absolutely free, in the terms that Spirit's able to think is absoluteness now. Be absolutely free is at this point to be intolerant to any object that stands as an interference, as an obstacle, as an inhibition to my freedom. So then anything that might present itself as such has to be eliminated. And that is the situation that Hegel describes as terror, for which the French Revolution seems to, provide him a nice example. It's something that he can plug in to demonstrate the logic that he's trying to think. So Hegel, as is already apparent, is not a historian in the regular empirical sense. He's giving a philosophical history, or seeing in history, with all its contingencies, a unique embodiment of conceptual truth, that allows him to give concrete flesh to his ideas, but also the other way around, also gives him his ideals. It's from history that thought emerges. So for our purposes, it's sufficient to recall the highlights of the French Revolution, that there was economic turmoil, that the state was in fiscal arrears, that there were food shortages, that there was massive social unrest and rioting, that the National Assembly, forged itself as the association, the assembly of the people, and vowed to stay together until a constitution was forged. That on July 14th, 1789, the Bastille was stormed, was taken over. That in August of 1789, there was a declaration of the rights of man and citizen, whose universality, the universality of which rights were at least pronounced, if not followed through. In January 1793, there was the trial and the execution of the king, Louis XVI. After which there was a lot of tension, wars with, a lot of conflict, a lot of beleaguerment, wars with European parties, threats of civil war and counter-revolution from within the country, a growing radicalization of the French Revolution, which didn't begin, radically. It began as the search for a constitutional monarchy, but it ended up as this radical democracy. In August of 1793, the so-called Reign of Terror was instituted under Robespierre. So state terror is an official, is officially institutionalized. It's not an insult. It's actually it's a term that's officially embraced by the state, and really crystallized in the law of suspects that was introduced, which can be described as a radical abridgment of the law, radical abridgment of the process of justice, whereby suspicion itself of what might happen, what the suspect might be thinking, suspicion itself became a legitimate grounds for really speeding up the point of split-second decision, the whole legal process. For being a suspect, you can be convicted and you can be killed ultimately. So thousands of the Reign of Terror is vivid in our imagination, the popular imagination, to this day, as the time when thousands of people were put to death by the guillotine, a new invention of this time, on the grounds of suspicion. This period of the terror is also notable for its approach to its radically innovative approach to time, to space. They adopted a new calendar. They got rid of the Christian calendar of AD and Anno Domini. They got rid of, and getting rid of the church. They got rid of everything associated with that. They rebooted time and history, starting from scratch. So the dating system begins again. Year one is the dates from the beginning of Republican rule, a new system of measurement that would be rational and universal, the metric system, the decimal system. The year became a 10-month year. The hour became a 10-second hour. The day became a 10-hour day, and so on. You can still see revolutionary clocks set to decimal time, and I have a few in my proper PowerPoint for this course that I'll post for you also. A new system of nomenclature whereby everything that had a hint or tinge of the old regime, the ancien régime. Everything would be named that was a Christian name, which was basically all personal names in France at that point, was taken away. Citizens renamed themselves with revolutionary names. Street names, place names were replaced by revolutionary names. This total sense that the past had to be, really had to be eliminated, had to be destroyed, so that history could start again. That was the sense of freedom. We're going to come back to this in a second. But I want to just get back to the terror part of it. These are all connected. So in 1794, just not even a year after the Reign of Terror had been instituted, Robespierre, the leader himself, was put on trial and immediately executed, having been found guilty of being a tyrant. Some people even call him trying to be king. And the terror kind of turned in on itself insofar as it became impossible to distinguish a judge from, the leader from the judge from the judge, the victim from the persecutor, and so on. And there's this period of reaction or de-radicalization that sets in, whereby the revolution pulls back from its revolutionary goals, and tries to stabilize itself. But also accompanying this stabilization is another kind of terror, as the old revolutionaries are, or people suspected of being revolutionaries, are themselves hunted out and being subjected to another kind of judicial violence and real violence and so on. So this is really quick history, but this is all you want to know for now, just to get into Hegel. Soon Napoleon steps up as the first consul, as the leader, and then by 1804 he's become the emperor of France, anointed by the Pope. And as emperor, he will conquer most of Europe and beyond, including Germany itself in 1806, as Hegel's closing off the phenomenology. Napoleon, this is still in the future, but it's an important future, and something that will become important to Hegel, soon enough. Napoleon will, continue to dominate until he himself is eventually defeated twice, first in Spain and then definitively in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo in Belgium, after which he will be exiled for the rest of his life on the island of St. Helena. And upon his defeat, there will be a restoration of all the major European monarchies, including the Bourbon dynasty in France. And this is a regression, I want to stress this, that Hegel will unambivalently regret. I mean, he will see this regression, this restoration of monarchy, as being a tragedy when it happens. He also will claim to have predicted this regression in the phenomenology itself. In 1815, he's kind of looking back, oh yeah, I saw this coming, which is something to think about. But the point that I'm stressing here is that there's not even a glimpse of what the future might hold after the revolution. Things have really kind of come to this breaking point. So, as you know, Hegel is a great simplifier. This is both his genius and also his flaw. So what he's giving us every time he looks at every shape, not simply the historical shapes of chapter 6, but every shape of spirit that we've been seeing, he's giving us a perfect distillation or abridgment or reduction. So just as he summarized the Greek polis in terms of the tragic clash between Antigone and Creon, between divine law and state or human law, just as he summarized the Roman Empire by the figure of the atomized person, which he introduces as a term of contempt, just as he presented absolute monarchy as the infectious transfusion of subjectivity from individual subject to monarch, the sovereign ruler, so too he will summarize the French Revolution in being crystallized as the reign of terror, by which he means essentially the reduction of freedom to violent, brutal, and deadly force. This is how freedom necessarily articulates itself at this point. So it's brutal, it's deadly, it's massive, but it's also, and this is the kind of paradox here, it's also utterly banal. This is a destruction that's both raging and total, and yet it takes an unembellished, unspectacular, flat, repetitive, seemingly meaningless and innocuous shape. This is interesting. I mean, Hegel's the only person who, at the time, was really describing it this way. Everybody else is really fascinated by all the blood and gore and the extravaganza and this kind of there's a certain awe and thrill and vicarious excitement about what's happening. Hegel's very measured in his description. It's very vivid. But at the same time, one of the things that's most vivid is his emphasis on his exaggeration, his emphasis on just how unvivid it is, how flat, how unremarkable all these deaths really are. And this is a crucial aspect of the terror itself. So in these very short pages, this very short section, Absolute Freedom and Terror, you will find some of Hegel's most vivid pages. There's a few unforgettable passages. And if you can just turn to your handout now, the passages that I sent to you last night, there you can see these kind of amazing passages. The most notable one is, I suppose, certainly the most oft-quoted one is paragraph, the Miller paragraph 590, where Hegel writes, and I just want to have it in your ears here as well. The sole work indeed of universal freedom is death, a death which has no inner significance or filling. For what is negated is the empty point of the absolutely free self. So he's talking about a death which has no inner significance or meaning, a meaningless death, a death which has no symbolic import or density or filling. It's empty. For what is negated is the empty point of the absolutely free self. It's empty precisely because the individual who has been killed, who's being executed on the scaffold by the guillotine, is him or herself not really a concrete individual. It's an empty individual because individuality, humanity is already being stripped from that individual. And if it hasn't, the guillotine will make sure that it has. By killing someone in this manner, the guillotine not only kills the individual, but it retroactively makes sure that the individual will cease to have been an individual. The individual, will no longer have been an individual. It rewrites the history of the individual, which is interesting given that the individual is essentially being executed because they were too individual, they were too particularity, they were resisting or in some way impeding the full universality of the state. That individuality, that stubborn particularity has to be taken away from that, and that is what happens in the flat, anonymous death of the guillotine, which Hegel describes, just pushing on in the same passage here, as the coldest and meanest of all deaths. The coldest and meanest meaning just not simply harsh, but just ordinary, cold, dull, with no more significance than cutting off a head of cabbage or swallowing a mouthful of water. So it's extraordinary vivid image here, and everything that's important about the French Revolution for Hegel is really encapsulated in this image of the guillotine as this kind of machine. It's almost like a kitchen device for chopping off heads of cabbages. It's a machine for the production of corpses on a large, impersonal scale, and in a way that strips the victim of all humanity. These are no longer human beings. It's not even animal deaths. It's cabbage heads. So this reduction, this reduced form of death, does not even have the dignity or the quality or the density of a death that you could describe as suffering, which is kind of strange, but not necessarily as bizarre as all that. The point of the one of the things that Hegel seems to be getting at is that suffering itself, not only does suffering itself have no more significance, it's just meaningless. So you might as well be drinking a sip of water for all the how do I say this? Yeah, just for all the experience or sensation it gives you. The just by the way, though, there may also be a historical reference here. The guillotine, as you may not know, some of you know this, is a modern invention. It's an invention of the French Revolution. It had been introduced as actually a humanitarian device. It was by a doctor, Dr. Guillotine, after whom the device is named, introduced it. He made this claim that not only was this an efficient and democratic way of killing people, but the death itself through the guillotine was so fast. The automatic nature that you string basically the blade drops and you are dead. The death was thought to be so fast, so instantaneous that he claimed that the victim felt nothing. He describes the experience of the blade on the neck as feeling just like a sensation, a little sensation in the back of the throat, as if as if you were just swigging a bit of water. So there's also there may be a reference to that, but the point is the absolute banality and lack of flavor of this death. Also, the anonymity of it. What could be more anonymous, more indistinguishable than a cabbage head? They're all really look the same. And this too is part of the democratization of death that was at issue here. Formerly, public executions had been really spectacular extravaganzas, drawn out theatrical events where everybody could look on. It was really theater, and where also the punishment was designed to fit the crime. So there are different kinds of executions. It's also a way of registering class divisions. So the nobility, supposedly had the sang-froid, had the noblesse, had the kind of dignity to be able to tolerate being beheaded by a sword. The common thief would have his hands chopped off because it was a thief, and so on. Here, all death is administered in exactly the same way. All death looks the same. There's no distinction, no individuality. And this is the issue, I suppose. The punishment actually does fit the crime, where the crime itself and the grounds for suspicion is itself, the grounds for suspicion itself becomes the warrant for the death sentence. The crime is in the assertion or the suspected planned assertion of an individuality that resists the universal law of freedom, which is seen as treachery, a crime against the state. So I'm exaggerating here. Hegel's exaggerating here, and this is the key. Not because he's incapable of saying other things, but this is the key feature that he sees as being philosophically significant in terms of the problematic of universality, individuality, I-ness, we-ness, freedom, that he's, and subjectivity that he's trying to think about. So absolute freedom is a freedom, and it's really notable. I mean, the fact that the adjective absolute has appeared, 200 pages before the end of the book is already should be a sign that something's not right here. I mean, there's a kind of premature indication of the absolute, which is the surest symptom that something is happening before things are ready. Absolute freedom, as Hegel describes it, is a freedom that universalizes itself immediately, uniformly, and without exception. This is Hegel's interpretation of what Rousseau calls the general will. And the guillotine is one of the effects of the guillotine is to, as I was saying just a minute ago, is to remove every last vestige of treacherous individuality. So this is the negation of something which doesn't really even exist. The what does he call it? The empty point of the absolutely free self. There's nothing to, what is being negated does not even have the substantial qualitative identity that will give this death any meaning or significance of what Hegel calls filling. So we seem to be very far from ethical life. We're so much hinged on the necessity to mark death as a symbolic, that is to say, a specifically human, spiritual event. Hence the emphasis in Antigone on rituals of burial and mourning and making what would otherwise be a simply natural or biological animal death into something that's spiritual, that's cultural, that has human significance. Dying as a cabbage head would seem to negate the possibility of all such symbolic work. And in fact, the heads that were separated from their bodies turned those bodies into indifferent matter, all distinguishing. To remove the face, and the basic distinguishing. It's not the bodies all look the same, but you remove the head, and the basic distinguishing feature of a person is removed, and everything was in fact thrown into a lime pit where the body was dissolved and disintegrated. So the point is, this is the opposite of what Hegel in the earlier ethical section called a death that is done or performed or made human. This is a death that happens. It happens not through the force of biological decay or nature. It happens by under the machine. And this machine, the guillotine, also stands for the mechanization and abridgment of justice, the legal short circuit or shortcut, where everything in the law, everything that the law has institutionalized as a process, that is, as a series of steps or mediations, everything in the law condenses into a single instantaneous moment. So paragraph 591, which is on your handout here, item 5, I think, being suspected, therefore, takes the place or has the significant and effect of being guilty. So to be suspect is already to be guilty. Intentions take the place of actions. I mean, merely to be thought to be harboring some insidious design is already to be guilty of that design. So the difference between doing something and planning to do something, between doing something in a possible future and doing something now is elided. And as such, the interval in the juridical or legal interval between being suspected, between being arrested, being charged, being convicted, being sentenced, being punished, all these steps or stages, which are distinct in any kind of formal legal system. There's a process. There's a reason why we talk about process. All the gap between all these stages is elided. There's just no space between crime and punishment. And this really puts pressure on the concept of law as a process, as an institution. So finally, we have the absolute effacement of all determinacy, of all objectivity. Hegel is describing the force of a pure negativity that can neither tolerate nor produce anything fixed or determinate, which would stand in the way of universal freedom precisely by not embodying it completely. So this is why, again, if you can return to your handout here, Hegel stresses not simply the destructiveness of absolute freedom, its lethal quality, but also its lack of productivity. Paragraph 589 here. Universal freedom can produce neither a positive work nor a deed. There is left for it only negative action. It is merely the fury of destruction. Sorry, I see on your handout there was a typo. It says merely the jury of destruction, which was like extremely Freudian slip, because there was no jury anywhere. It was just fury. So merely the fury of destruction, no positive deed, no work, nothing, merely action without any object being produced by that action. And this is part of this flows from paragraph 588, that consciousness can let nothing break loose, to become a freestanding object standing over against it. We just have pure freedom, and freedom can neither tolerate any obstacle nor in its path, nor can it produce anything, because anything outside the act of freedom itself would itself become an obstacle to freedom. So this kind of freedom is this necessant and by necessity destructive activity that can not only leave nothing surviving in its wake, but also can produce nothing that will survive the act of freedom itself. So it follows, going back to the passage 588 here, it follows that it can achieve nothing positive, either universal works of language or of reality, either of laws or general institutions of conscious freedom, or of deeds and works of a freedom that wills. And there's no product. It would look like there's no work being done, although Hegel does speak of work, but it's a peculiar one. So paragraph 590, he says, the sole work and deed of freedom is death, a death which, has no more significance in filling. It's like cabbage death, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is freedom. This is this freedom that is, that seems to be, absolutely negative, universal, without product, without a past, because nothing can be left standing. No objectivity can be left standing. That means anything that's there theoretically has to be destroyed, but also has no future, because anything outside or after that would survive the act of production itself would be a limit on that production. So there's this curious enactment of a pure present. This is what terror is. Now, at this point, and I had asked you to, I've been asking you to think about this theme of infection and the way in which this kind of burst into view the last couple of weeks in the text. I mean, not by my design, but just in the text, it kind of it sprang into prominence just the very moment that we all went into self-quarantine. But at this point, in thinking about terror, and this total terror that leaves nothing intact, nothing in its wake. At this point, I want to go back to something that was planted like a germ cell at the very beginning of when we were just on the verge of moving into spirit. And this is, again, the theme of infection. I want to go back to the master slave, where these themes of death, freedom, and terror, and work, are for the first time explicitly elaborated, and just see where this goes and how we can, connect the dots here. What stands out on second reading of paragraph 196. One of the two paragraphs I want to look at today is how the slave is said to be infected by fear. His fear itself is registered as a kind of infection. So long before the Enlightenment came along and started, and language itself became so foregrounded as the vehicle or the medium through which subjectivity was transmitted, as if it were a contagious disease. Long before that, it turns out that subjectivity is already infected. It's infected with the other by fear. It's the contact with the absolute otherness of the other person which is the master, the Lord, someone who wields the power of life and death over one, that introduces into the slave, into the victim, this feeling of terror, which is described as this ravaging infection that invades and pervades every pore of his existence. So let's go back to the experience of fear in the master slave, which is described as a confrontation with pure negativity, which, and this seems to be the difference from the experience of absolute freedom and terror, seems to be a profoundly productive encounter with negativity. So fear is the fear of the slave, something that Hegel really stresses in paragraph 194 and 196 on your handout, is absolute. It's pervasive. It informs all aspects of the slave's life. Every moment of the slave's existence is registered as being really registered as living at gunpoint. One's under the force of, one's under the threat of total annihilation, and that's what the experience of being a slave is. So the object of slave, I want to just look at this section rather carefully now, because I want to wind up on this point. The experience of the slave is the experience of the slave the master appears to the slave. This is the experience of the slave, that the master appears as something absolutely alien, absolutely other than me. And in this otherness, he is an object of my fear. Other, not because he's strange or different or coming from a different country or coming from a different culture or anything like that. The otherness is absolute. The otherness of the master is absolute because he wields death. He represents my own annihilation. So he's absolutely other to my own survival, to my own life. The master represents my own non-existence, and can be, is experienced as lethal. So absolutely negative to my own being. So fear before, this is why Hegel describes fear before a human master as being ultimately fear in the face of what he calls the absolute master, which is death. It's more than a human being that one is actually afraid of. One's afraid of death. One's afraid of just non-existence, of one's own being being eliminated. That's absolute otherness for Hegel. That's absolute negativity. It's not local differences. It's death itself. So, and the crucial shift here, and this is why the dialectic of the master slave is so is so suggestive, is that the slave, there's a shift or a conversion from fear to work, as the slave identifies with this negativity, which it registers as being completely other to it. Sorry, just a second. This negativity, which is so not me because it's death, this negativity is mine because precisely because it saturates me, it pervades me, it infects me. It completely defines me, body and spirit and mind. And so the otherness is not other to me, it's actually my otherness. Death is me. I identify with this death. It defines me. So I am profoundly other to myself in this experience of radical total fear. And it's in this sense that I take on the destructiveness that I fear. Under fear of death, fear of my Lord, of my master, of the Lord, the master, death itself. Under fear of death, I work for the master. And my work itself, I become a maker, I become a producer. And this work itself is the expression of the negativity that is my fear. In work, I don't simply work because I'm afraid. My work itself is the positive expression of this fear, in that in my work, I act out a negative activity with respect to the whole world. This is what work is for Hegel. This is how he defines it very explicitly in these amazing paragraphs 194 to 196. It's not just driven by fear of death, it's an acting out of this negativity, such that I demolish the whole world as it is. I destroy the whole world. The world is not left the way it was before I entered it as a producer. That's precisely what it means to produce something. Is to make something new. You make something new by destroying the old. This is why Hegel says in paragraph, sorry, if you could just get to the handout here. In paragraph 194, this is the paragraph about being undone and shaking and trembling and all that stuff. What Miller bizarrely translated as being unmanned, which was not called for. He not only is the slave just trembling, shaking in every fiber of its being, but also everything solid and stable has been shaken to its foundations. I'm continuing to read from Miller, paragraph 194 here. He describes this absolute melting away of everything stable. Everything is shaking, everything is coming down. There's a complete meltdown of reality. This is what it means to make something, the natural universe. And this also means any universe that has become naturalized, or that feels natural, or we take as if it were natural, because we can't imagine anything else. Nature itself is being demolished as a new world is being made. This is what it means to remake the world, to remake the givenness of what's presented to us, be it the wood in the tree, or the flesh in the chicken that you cook, or the institution that just feels natural. This is what it means to remake something as the product of my own activity. So instead of being given to me as something like natural and there, it becomes something produced by me. This is what work is, and this is what it does. Work is the embodiment of my own labor. The world becomes the crystallization of my labor. It's kind of a sinkhole where I deposit my own subjectivity, such the world now bears my signature. It's mine. It's me. I've made it over again. But this is, this is destructive. I mean, before I can't make something except by destroying an old form. I destroy the world in making it mine. And this also means destroying the old self. I have to remake myself as a laboring self. I become a worker, which, as we talked about before, also means essentially as a worker, I'm no longer, I no longer inhabit my body in a purely natural way. I have to time everything. I have to delay stuff. I have to delay what I want to do because I got to be at work. I have to time my meals. I have to time my bathroom breaks. I mean, I train my body to be a working body. So my own body has been destroyed, if you like. It's no longer just this natural creature who just roams around. It's a trained creature. And the stakes of this work, and this is why fear is so important again, the stakes of this work are, are really infinite. Labor is not simply something you do. This is why he stresses that you can't just be afraid from time to time or once in a while. The work expresses my subjectivity totally, meaning the world itself becomes a total opportunity for a total locus for my subjectivity to inscribe itself, precisely because my fear is total. Labor is undertaken with the consciousness that any mess up, any failure, any lapse in productivity brings with it a mortal danger. One works as a worker, one works in fear, not of just getting into trouble, getting scolded. One works in fear for one's own life. Now, for the most part, and of course, this is an exaggeration because Hegel is trying to crystallize something. And obviously, and Hegel would be the first to say this, obviously we don't think about this very much. You go to work, you know, this fear is attenuated, it's implicit, it's even unconscious. You put it to the side, or you just experience it as anxiety, or just fear of being humiliated, or fear of getting a bad mark, or fear of not being good at your job, or fear what other people think, and so on. You go to work, you just do it because, without thinking about it, you do it just because that's work. You can even enjoy your work. You can find it interesting or not interesting. This fear can be very, very much in the background. But when the chips are down, like when the boss calls you in, or when there's layoffs, and the possibility of work is removed from you, when survival becomes actual survival, is on the table, you suddenly have access to what Hegel describes as this initial absolute fear, this constitutive terror that is actually the core of your identity as a worker, namely that ultimately, unless you work, you die. This is what it means to be a worker, is to be soaked in fear. So I want to look, you know, carefully at what Hegel writes in paragraph 196, where Hegel describes this total saturation of the worker by fear as a total infection. So it's because of this total infection that the fear is pervasive. If it is not experienced absolute fear, I'm quoting from the middle of paragraph 196, if it's not experienced absolute fear, but only some lesser dread, negativity has remained for it something external. Its substance has not been infected by it through and through. Sorry. And because of it's because of this total infection, this total pervasive fear, that work itself is able to assume the universal significance that it does. What Hegel calls, this is the end of paragraph 196, a universal formative activity, an absolute notion, an absolute concept. Work, through work, I'm still quoting Hegel here, through work, the worker becomes a master over the whole of objective being. The worker is a master, not over his master, not yet, but over a master over all of objective being, over all of reality. I mean, to the extent that fear is global, mastery is global. One's work becomes total work because it becomes a total expression of the negativity that defines one, that one lays out over the world. I mean, when the world itself becomes the vehicle for this negativity to express itself, and that's why work that accounts for the destructive quality of work. No matter how creative it is, the more creative it is, the more destructive it has to be, because the more it has to eliminate in order to make something of its own, something new. So fear, in the case of the slave, in the master-slave situation, the fear was, this is why the fear was the key to his universality, the key to his freedom via work. So with absolute freedom and terror, we just fast forward now from that, you know, from 194, from those episodes, from those paragraphs to these supercharged paragraphs on absolute freedom and terror. With revolutionary terror, we have universal terror. We have a kind of work. I mean, Hegel insists on calling it work, but what kind of work is it? So with, with the master slave had noted the destructiveness inherent in work, latent in work, that you have to destroy what there is in order to make something. And fear alone gives you unique access to this power of destructiveness. The French Revolution, takes this destructiveness very seriously, as we've been seeing. Inventing a new clock and a new calendar is to and a new way of measuring space and time is kind of an amazingly creative relationship to time and space, but also profoundly destructive one. I mean, nothing from the past can survive. So all institutions, all institutions, well, the major institutions that count, the crown and the church, are eliminated. A massive number of individuals are destroyed on the scaffold. But unlike with the slave, there really is no production being registered. Sure, they made up a new calendar, but that only lasted, really only lasted a few years before it just became too impractical to use, and they went back to the old dating system. There are no, at least what Hegel's expressing and exaggerating, as always in the revolution, is that there's nothing that survives. The slave worker left his signature on the world. This is what it means to produce things. He left a fingerprint on nature, so that nature now is essentially human. It's been humanized. Even if you look out the window and the tree seems to be growing on its own, which it is, you see it as a landscape. You see it as a garden. It's no longer the same tree. Even if you go hiking in the wilderness, it's no longer the same wilderness because it's a provincial park or something like that. Okay. Whereas the subject of terror leaves no object. No object, logically speaking, can survive his own work. This is just a great emptiness. That is the product of terror. So 589, Hegel writes, this passage that we already saw, you can produce neither a positive work nor deed. There's left for it only negative action. It's merely the fury of destruction, of pure destructiveness, without which ultimately will have nothing to destroy. And that's where Hegel, again, writes, paragraph 590. This is the cabbage head passage. That's the sole work and deed of universal freedom is death, this empty, meaningless, insignificant, cold, flat, cabbage-like, water-like death. He calls that a work, which is interesting, because it's a work which seems to be reduced to pure activity, which seems to not be productive, except insofar as you can consider you can consider a kind of blank space and empty time, a kind of pure void, to be a product, to be itself a historical product and artifact, which I think Hegel is saying that is a kind of work is being done in this act of total negation. So the question is, what two questions is, one of them, and I wanted you to think about this on your own. I'm just going to leave it for you. To read this comes uncomfortably close to the kind of abstract negativity that Hegel had warned about in the introduction to the Phenomenology of Spirit. Paragraph 79, he's going through the kinds of skepticism, and he talks about, I'm just going to quote from paragraph 79 about the skepticism, it's also on your handout, which only ever sees pure nothingness in its results and abstracts from the fact that this nothingness is specifically the nothingness of that from which it results. In other words, he's talking about this kind of this negation, which is essentially amnesiac. It forgets that to negate something, there has to be a something to negate. It forgets that every negation is therefore a determinate negation. It has a past. And from that past, it's able to generate a kind of future. This is why so determinate negation is essentially productive for Hegel, because its destructiveness is inherently bound with a kind of a minimal retention of the object being destroyed, such that one can, one is working with it, one is producing it. So production, the slave's productivity is a kind of determinate negativity. It's making something out of its own, out of the destruction that it perpetuates. Whereas it's not clear from what Hegel says that anything is being retained or anything is being produced other than this strange force of negativity itself. So I just want to maybe, stop on this note. Hegel stresses that there's no, as I say, this is kind of the end of this chapter. It's not the end of chapter 6, which kind of carries on for quite a while, but it's the end of this particular, this particular arc, this political arc. Hegel, there's absolutely no indication of where one might be going forward. Hegel does emphasize, however, that there's no return to any flaws. In every shape of the past has been destroyed. Everything has been annihilated. There's no going back. I mean, this is the premise of the dialectic, as we've already seen. I mean, every time spirit makes a, comes to a kind of sticky point or difficult point, it wants to go back to a previous stage, but the previous stage is precisely what got it into this impasse in the first place. So that's kind of the structural, that's the structural motor of the dialectic. Is that there can be no going back, but here this is actually formalized and inscribed in terms of this radical amnesia, that it cannot go back, that everything has been eliminated. All these determinations, he says, all past forms, this is paragraph 594, all past forms of spirit have vanished in the loss that's suffered by the self in absolute freedom. So there's not even nostalgia possible for a kind of archaic past. This is not to say that nostalgia wasn't generated. It's not, I mean, and in fact, as Hegel could not have known in 1806, but as in 1815, he will claim to have already predicted, there will be a going back. There'll be a restoration of the monarchy. The kings will come back, and everything will seem to return. But conceptually speaking, there's no going back. This is just a, sorry, cancel this phone call. Yeah, so there's a total. So this is the suspense. This is where we're really left dangling. There's no going back, but it's very unclear how we would go forward either. And I'm just gonna leave you here. Maybe we can discuss this in the discussion later if you want. So that's it for now. I'll be available for more informal discussion, questions during my office hours, during the class discussion period today, and my office hours on Friday, which are really a version of the same thing. And again, for individual contact. And again, most importantly, I want to say, just take good care of yourselves. And this is the most important thing. You'll get through this academic part, very soon. And the main thing is just take care of yourself and keep well. And I hope you're all doing okay. Talk to you soon, I hope, and hope to see you one of these days. Thanks. Bye. Trying to end this meeting. How to do that? Stop recording.